In part 1 on metanarrative, we looked at writing the metanarrative lead and using Wikipedia as a model for writing a few hundred words that introduces your world by describing its most significant features. The metanarrative is a story about your world. Much of your metanarrative entails describing the structures and substructures of your world, explaining the social forces at play in the world, and what daily life is like in that society. I generally recommend that a metanarrative should be around 4,000 to 5,000 words. Any less than that, and you're likely missing some important details or relying too much on generalizations, and much more than that, and it starts to get hard to keep all the ideas straight. A well-structured metanarrative can climb to around 7,000 words and still work, but later on in this video I'll share some techniques for breaking up the metanarrative and making the information more accessible. Now, if you've been following along in the process, you should have constructed a model of your world using the structures of governance, economics, social relations, and cultural influences, and the 14 substructures beneath them, assigning each of the substructures a value from 1 to 5, and identifying any substructure currently undergoing any kind of change. You should have a metanarrative lead of around 300 to 600 words that describes the broad features of your world's scope, sequence, and perspective, and highlights the most unique and important parts of the world. If you haven't done that work, do that before writing the metanarrative body. As I've said before, groups wind up wasting a lot of time rewriting things they should have cleared up earlier, so seriously, write that metanarrative lead first. We're going to look at Wikipedia's pages of a similar scope as your world again in this video, but using Wikipedia's models breaks down a little bit here because your metanarrative is an actual narrative, a story about the world and its culture, whereas Wikipedia intends to be more factual information. Still, the structure of a Wikipedia page is still useful as a model, so let's start there. Don't worry about the information you'll need to fill in later. The metanarrative is something that gets filled in over time and is regularly revised and refined as your world snaps into sharper focus. While Wikipedia pages aren't uniform in terms of the information they present, they follow a general, consistent pattern. When working on your metanarrative, build it using these parts. A metanarrative lead, which I discussed in the last video. Then a brief history. So resist the urge to info dump here, just hit the high points. Remember a few videos ago when I was talking about the framework and I suggested adding just 2 or 3 major events in the history? Try to stick to those for now, and I'll show you how not to overstuff the history section in just a bit. Geography. We'll discuss this geography more in the video about mapping your fictional world, but this section too can be pretty brief. Hit the high points of the climate, maybe the major geographic features, but ideally your map will do a lot of this work visually. Politics and governance. This is where you'll describe the structures and substructures of governance, including any infrastructure like government buildings, hospitals, schools. I'll talk more about how to write this and the other structural categories as a narrative in just a minute. The next one usually is the economic situation of the world, using the economic substructures to help outline how you're going to describe it. After this comes the description of the society, which usually involves different kinds of demographic data, characteristics of different groups within the society, and points of social tension or unrest. We'll talk more specifically about demographics in the video on populating your world's catalog. And then finally comes aspects of culture that are prominent in the society, including the things that are very prevalent in the culture, as well as practices that are discouraged or shunned, for example, consumption of alcohol. Search around and you will find a lot of variation between Wikipedia pages. Some include demographics before the governance, and others blend the social relations and cultural aspects of the society. There's no right or wrong way to do it, provided you've thought through and discussed all 14 of the base substructures, and any other relevant ones that you may have added for your world. You don't need to have subheadings for each of the 14 substructures, but some groups like to do that. I do recommend that you keep the structural categories, though, at least something similar to them. In terms of length, I ask students to shoot for around 1,000 words for each of the 4 structural categories, plus a few hundred words for the geography and the history, which is where that around 5,000 words estimate comes from. Now, here's another thing I tell students to do, and they often don't do it, and then they regret it. If you're in a group of, say, 4 people, when it comes to writing the metanarrative, it's common for one person to volunteer to write the entire section on governance, one to take economics, one to take social relations, and the other to take cultural influences. Now listen up when I say this. Don't do this. It invariably leads to inconsistencies in parts of the world that don't fit together. Instead, here's what you do. Work on each structural category in pairs. Have 2 people write up half of one of the substructural sections, then stop, mix the groups up, and then finish them off. So for example, Amanda would work on politics and economics, Brian works on economics and society, Cynthia works on politics and culture, and Dion works on society and culture. Those pairs write around 500 words, or about half the total length for that substructure, describing the features of that category. About halfway through, switch up so each person is working on finishing off the description for a new structural category. Now, why do it this way? It guarantees that everybody is reviewing and contributing to all parts of the meta-narrative. So in this example, when they switch up, Amanda and Cynthia are finishing off social relations. They can ask for any clarifications to Brian and Dion and what they were thinking about that structure when they drafted the first half. So Amanda will bring her knowledge of the politics section to the social relations category, and Cynthia will bring her knowledge of the cultural influences section to the social relations category. This is another opportunity for the contributors to clarify any confusing parts, eliminate lingering assumptions, and resolve any inconsistencies. So seriously, write down who is going to work on which section first, and then have them only write about half of the final output of that narrative. So one strategy is to bullet point all the major features of the structural category, but only write out about half of it as the narrative the first time around. Then everyone switches categories and finishes them off. Trust me when I say this works to make a more consistent, coherent meta-narrative. There's an old writing joke. If I'd had more time, I would have written a shorter letter, meaning that being concise is harder than blathering on, and this is never more true than in a world-building project. Condense these structural descriptions down to the most pertinent and important bits of information that describe the society as a whole. You're still painting with a pretty broad brush here, describing things at a high level in generalities. We get to the nitty-gritty specifics in the next step, populating the catalog. So remember, you don't have to do all that work of detailing things in the meta-narrative. In fact, it's better if you don't, because no one wants to read an exhaustive description of your world, often not even other members of your group. So here's the trick I promised to show you to keep your meta-narrative tightly focused on the broader story of the world, and it has to do with the catalog. As I'll get into in the next video, the catalog is made up of entries for individual people, places, things, events, and groups. If you're finding that your meta-narrative is starting to get bloated with too many specific details, now don't delete, but cut the information and paste it into a new catalog entry. I call this branching, and it allows you to cover general ideas in the meta-narrative, but then link to a more comprehensive description elsewhere. Wikipedia pages use links all the time to keep the page that you're on focused on the single topic, and it's an effective technique to keep the meta-narrative focused on that aspect of the world. Okay, this is exciting stuff, as your world should really be coming into focus now. At the end of the process, you should have around 5,000 words of meta-narrative that describes what the world is like to live in, featuring all the stuff that makes it unique and interesting across those 4 structural categories. The last stage of the world building process is building and populating a catalog. I guarantee you that you will be bursting with ideas by the time you get to this point, so the next video is really how to make the most of those catalog entries. So see you then.